Lauren Hollows for NOI Education Services, and today we are continuing on with our CRICOS 101 series, where we are talking all things international education. So we're following on this week from where we left off last week, which was when you've got course progression, and now we're looking at actually having to report an overseas student visa holder. So if you haven't watched last week's video, really strongly recommend that you actually do, because obviously a lot of the things that happen during that course progression, course monitoring phase is what will then feed into what's going to happen when you actually need to start reporting the overseas student, okay? So when we are reporting overseas student visa holders, there's not a lot of leeway when it actually comes to the provider. So if we go into fact sheet number 8 under the national code, it states very, very clearly that registered providers must report overseas students who do not meet course progress or, if applicable, attendance requirements. Okay. If the registered provider has assessed the overseas student is not meeting course progress or attendance requirements in accordance with its policies, the registered provider must give the overseas student a written notice of its intention to report. The registered provider also needs to advise the student of their right to access the registered provider's internal complaints and appeals policy within 20 working days. So obviously 20 working days, we're looking at about a month. So it's obviously, this is a process that goes over a relatively long period of time, and therefore it's really, again, we go back to, it's very important that this is a proactive process that's happening on a really regular basis, okay? It's not something that you should be doing. I really, really strongly recommend that you're doing it at least every term, and realistically, I would be suggesting probably twice a term. So in week 5 and week 10 of every term, you should be doing a course progression check and starting that process of notifying the student, putting in place your student support services well before we get to 6 months into the course and the student's now 10 units behind where they need to be, okay? So the requirements of the RTO is obviously within the national RTO standards. You have to have a complaints and appeals process. But specifically within the CRICOS sector, you have to have the complaints and appeals process. You've got some additional requirements in relationship to the deadlines and the timeframes. But you've also, it specifically has to cover this intent to report process, okay? So the registered provider must maintain the overseas student enrollment by only reporting a breach of course progress or attendance in PRISMS, right, which is a provider registration and international student management system. If the internal and external complaints process has been completed and the breach has been upheld, the overseas student has chosen not to access that service within the 20-day working period, or the student has chosen not to access the external complaint period, or the overseas student withdraws from the appeals process by notifying the provider in writing, okay? So you need to have both an internal and an external. In the case of the external within CRICOS students, that's actually a, it's automatically set. So we've got the overseas ombudsman that most students would go to on these particular matters. The only time they would go to ASQA to lodge the complaint is if it's in relation to the quality of training. So it's, again, this is another thing that's important. Again, when we're orienting our students and when we're providing information to our students upon enrollment, you can see how everything is really dominoes within the CRICOS sector. It's important that students understand where to go to when they have that complaint or appeal. So firstly, you need to have an internal body that needs to address that. Now, that's generally going to go to the CEO, or it's going to go to, for example, an academic manager. That's your first kind of process. So it's going to go to the academic manager, or it's going to go to the CEO. I generally recommend an academic manager if you are large enough within your capacity to be able to manage that, because then the appeal for that can then go to the CEO as well, and you can show that you've kind of got a two-pronged process, okay? So the first step, they've got 20 days, they can access the internal appeals policy, okay? Let's say they lose that internal appeal. So basically what's going to happen there is that the student has to demonstrate that they either are meeting course progress requirements or that they have genuine reasons for not being able to meet the course progress requirements. So again, this will fall potentially into your critical incident policy, but there'll be very, very specific reasons why. So let's say, for example, there was a medical reason, they were able to provide sufficient medical documentation. You know, compelling and compassionate is going to fall into this. Again, compelling and compassionate, we're going to have to talk about in another episode. But there are very specific circumstances under which compelling and compassionate applies. And there has to be evidence for all of that. Now, collecting evidence when we start to get to this point, the pointy part of this process can be very challenging. We're often potentially dealing with sensitive matters. Just as an example, with some of the students that I've dealt with, I've had students claim that a relative has died. Unfortunately, I say claim because in certain circumstances, we've actually proven that that was not the case. We've had students claim medical concerns and things like that, and then not being able to provide any evidence of that, okay? I have actually had to go to students and ask for death certificates of family members at points in time. I know all of this sounds really horrible, but when you have a very robust process showing that the student has been given multiple opportunities, multiple warnings, you've got 50 emails going to the student saying, hey, you didn't show up to class today. Hey, you didn't turn in your assessment. Hey, we think you need some support. Hey, we've scheduled you in for a course progress monitoring session. Hey, we've scheduled you in for an additional support session with your trainer. Hey, you didn't show up for the additional support session with your trainer. When you have all of that evidence, this is a very emotive issue for students who really genuinely want to stay in Australia. And unfortunately, all sorts of excuses come out. Sometimes they're very legitimate. Sometimes they are very much not. Unfortunately, you have to go back to your process. You have to adhere to your policies, and evidence needs to be provided. So you literally can't just go on the perspective of the student says, oh, I've been really unwell, and you go, oh, okay, that's fine, then no worries. No, if you're going to go and do that, then you need to then say, okay, fine, well, if you've been unwell, can you provide us with a medical certificate? Like, it's very clear in our policies, if you don't show up to class, you need to provide a medical certificate. If they say, well, I've been really sad because I'm struggling to adjust to life in Australia. This is another common one that students will come back with. You'll say, okay, well, we fully appreciate that, but like, here's where we've provided you with an induction. Here's where we identified that you needed some support services. Here's where we scheduled you in for an appointment with our counselor. Here's where we've scheduled you in for an appointment with our student support team. Here's where we've scheduled you in for an appointment with our trainer, and you have not shown up to any of those. So, you've been provided with X amount of opportunities to access support mechanisms, and you've chosen not to do that until now, right? So it's about really very clearly saying to the student, we've given you multiple opportunities. Now, here's the kicker. If you, as the RTO, we're not monitoring course attendance and you haven't emailed the student, if you did not follow your processes, if you have not been providing opportunities for catch-ups, if you have not been providing the student with multiple notifications that, this is coming down the track, when it does go to an external appeals process, you're going to get your butt kicked. Okay. So you need to have clear evidence that you have followed a process, that you have been doing these regular checks. So we're not getting to the 6-month mark. You've never done a check on a student before. You're now all of a sudden going, oh, shoot, this student hasn't completed a single unit and they're 6 months into the course. I now need to cancel them. That's not acceptable. Okay, you have responsibilities as a provider. You need to be doing this on a regular basis. By the time that it gets to an intent to report stage, I would expect an RTO to have at least I would say 10 to 20 emails going to the student. And I know RTOs that do this on a very regular basis. By the time they get to an intent to report stage, they would have 50. They would have at least 50 emails, at least 50 phone calls. They would have multiple intervention attempts by the time they get to this phase, okay? So this is why administration within an international RTO is generally a little bit bigger than we would be seeing in a domestic RTO in relationship to the number of, like, the ratio of students to administration. So you've now issued an intent of a notification to report. The student has gone through the internal process, and your internal process has gone, no, we've actually followed our process. We don't believe that you have sufficient evidence to demonstrate that you have compassionate and compelling circumstances. And so now we're going to move on to, you've got to give the student so many days, and I think it's 20 again, to access the external complaints and appeals service. So you issue the student with an intent to report. They've got a month to access your internal complaints process. The internal complaints process within your RTO can go for potentially another 10 days. It may be longer. They then have got so many days to access the external policies. Now, the external processes, when it goes through things like the ombudsman, what they're looking at is they're not rehashing the case. What they're looking at is whether or not you as the RTO have employed a fair process in line with your policies, in line with the legislation. So in that particular case, at that point, they're just going to go, has the RTO followed a process? However, I would always give that up to 2 months. Okay. It can take 2 months before you actually hear back. And through that entire period, so keep in mind, you know, you've already taken a month for your internal process. You've potentially got 2 months for your external process. That's another entire term. During that time, the student needs to continue to attend, and you as the RTO need to continue to provide your support services. So this is a very long and drawn out process. If you are issuing the intent of the notification to report at the end of term 2, it is potentially likely the end of term 3 before you are actually reporting that student through the PRISMS system. Okay. And during that time frame, look, that's often the time frame where, like, all of a sudden you'll get a student who, hey, I've now completed all of my assessments and I'm like mostly up to date. You need to think about how you are potentially going to handle that. Okay. So look, we always like to give students the benefit of the doubt. There are a lot of things that come up. And as I say, having to adjust to life in Australia can be quite a big stress for students. A lot of them are adjusting to life by themselves for the first time, and that can be a big phase. But again, it's about being proactive. It's about early intervention. It's about documenting the hell out of the process to hopefully avoid getting to this point. But you need to be aware that during those 3 months, from the point that you issue the intent to report to when you potentially register it in PRISMS, there's a lot of things that can happen during that period. And the more robust your policy and your process is, and the more information you're providing to students, the better it's going to be. And the other thing that you've got to be aware of is that during that process, once you kick off something like this, there's a high likelihood that you're then going to get things like financial issues that will come up, whether or not the student will continue to pay their fees, whether or not the student will actively seek to transfer providers. That's another common tactic. When a student realizes that they're not going to be able to win their appeal, they will start to look at other providers that they can transfer to. They will stop providing fees. So there's a huge administrative workload that goes into around this. If you can preempt all of that by getting early notification in and providing those support services and getting the student back on track nice and early, the first time they miss an assessment, the first time they fail to complete a unit of competency on time, it reduces the overall administrative burden on the RTO as a whole. So this is why it is just really, really important to always be proactive. It's important that your trainers and your admin understand your course attendance and your course progression policy. And it's why it's important that from marketing through enrollment through orientation, that you're very, very clear with your students on the expectations that they have to meet. So make sure that your policy has worked in all of those things, like those 20-day periods, that it's clear who they talk to about the internal appeal or the internal complaint, that there is a form for them to lodge an internal appeal and an internal complaint. Make sure you have a requirement for them to provide you with evidence to support their claim or their appeal, whatever it may be. Make sure that within your policy you have clear outlines as to how they can go about accessing the external student ombudsman, emails, phone numbers, all of that sort of stuff, and put in there like what it is that each of those bodies does. Okay, so as I said, the external ombudsman is not going to relitigate the case as such. What they're going to look at is whether or not you as the provider have done the right thing and followed a correct process. And if you followed your correct process and you can show them, here's where the warnings went out to them, here's where the intent to report went out to them, here's where they lodged the appeal, here was the evidence that they lodged, here was our reasons for denying that appeal, and you need to provide very clear reasons for denying that appeal. We'll go into that when we talk about complaints and appeals processes. As long as you have done all of that, they will generally side with yourself. Look, it's run by people, so there are occasions where they will choose to relitigate the case, even though that's not technically in their purview. But generally, they can be pretty good about that sort of thing. So make sure you've got all of that built into your policies and procedures. If you decide that you need some help with writing your policies and procedures, then of course you can come and talk to Anna Wire. We do have a full set of international student policies and procedures that we can help you implement within your RTO, give you a really solid starting point and a range. We've also got a range of forms and templates that help with that as well. More importantly, we have some fantastic assessment tools, and if your students are using our assessment tools, they're going to love them, so they're going to be far more likely to actually want to engage with them because they're pretty good assessments in my personal opinion. But anyway, that is it for Anna Wire today. Went a little bit longer on this one, but there is a lot to get your head around when it comes to reporting international students. I hope you guys have found this helpful. We do have a full playlist of all the CRICOS videos, so if you're interested in kind of getting it all in one hit, you can find that in our playlist bar. As always, we are dropping videos every Wednesday and Friday. Smash the like button, hit the notification so that you never miss an Anna Wire video. If you do want to support us, check out our memberships, or you can just make a comment or share this video with your network. We really appreciate that, and it helps to support us in everything that we do. My name is Lauren Hollows. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you have a great day. This is us done for Anna Wire Education Services.